And we are recording.
Thank you. It's good to see some attendees are trickling in. For those of you who are already in the webinar, we're going to be waiting for just a minute more so that the attendees will getting settled in the Zoom environment. The number of attendees is still going up. Just a little bit more time, we'll get this going. Well, maybe we should get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very, very delighted to welcome you to the first webinar of a new webinar series organized by the National Science Foundation Institute for Geospatial Understanding through an integrative discovery environment, in short, I-GUIDE. I'm Xiaowen Wang from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, serving as the principal investigator and director of NSF I-GUIDE. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our today's speaker and discussant. Dr. Eric Schuck is our speaker, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. Eric has quite a broad research interest in geographic information science, cyber GIS, and high-performance geospatial computing, and among other topics. But most notably related to today's webinar is Eric's passion about education and workforce development issues revolving around these topics. And the discussant that we have today is Dr. Mike Goodchild, who's Emeritus Professor of Geography at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also holding a number of research positions at other institutions, but Dr. Goodchild really does not need much introduction. He's best known for his groundbreaking work and multi-decade leadership for the development of the field of geographic information science. And without further ado, I'm gonna pass the Zoom floor to Dr. Schuck. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Xiaowen. And yeah, personally, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first I-GUIDE webinar. So Xiaowen mentioned, my name is Eric Schuck. I'm an associate professor at University of Minnesota, and I really want to thank you all for taking the time to join me in this exploration, where we're going to be spending the next hour or so navigating the evolving educational landscape in a convergent geospatial world. Before we get going, I know that we have a broad and diverse audience, and this is the first I-GUIDE webinar. So I wanted to start by showing this brief video to introduce I-GUIDE, formerly known as the Institute for Geospatial Understanding through an Integrative Discovery Environment. So I want to kick us off by showing this short film here.
The world is constantly changing around us. Climate change, land use change, population change, to make just a few examples. The changes are causing grand challenges, including, for example, biodiversity loss, water and food insecurity. Fundamental geospatial understanding derived from geographic and spatial data are critical to tackle these challenges and contribute a more sustainable and resilient future. I-GUIDE stands for the Institute for Geospatial Understanding through an integrative discovery environment funded by the National Science Foundation. We aim to address these challenges by revolutionizing how geospatial data are harnessed across many science domains, ranging from social, behavioral, and economic sciences to geo and environmental sciences, and to computer information and data sciences. I-GUIDE has 6 key components with the geospatial data at the core. The research we are doing is responding to and developing systems that are resilient against climate-related disasters and require an understanding of the complex interactions involved. We cannot just look at a single discipline or a single place where disaster may occur, but need to understand how increased vulnerability of our infrastructure, such as aging dams, makes economic sectors like manufacturing and transportation more vulnerable. We are bringing experts from many fields together to tackle these challenges holistically.
Science has been generating a lot of data. I-GUIDE is going to help scientists work together as never before, harnessing this data to find new ways to look at these challenges as they truly exist in nature, using cutting-edge technologies like machine learning. New and existing analysis tools and technology platforms need to be brought together to make it easier for scientists from different disciplines to collaborate on research, undistracted by the daunting challenges associated with enormous data streams.
For this effort, I-GUIDE is partnering with many organizations spanning academia, research, government, and industry to exchange knowledge and resources. In engaging with these partners and an even broader community of scientists and stakeholders will allow us to create real-world solutions together.
As we create new technologies and methodologies, we are also carefully looking into the future, educating and training the next generation of scientists, policymakers, and industry leaders in this cross-cutting work.
Throughout our process, we'll be carefully evaluating the outcomes of this work, ensuring that the tools and knowledge created by I-GUIDE are useful to the broader community, and that our interactions with partners, students, and scientific users better prepare them to address our most pressing global challenges.
These 6 components of I-GUIDE not only contribute to advancing the sciences surrounding these challenges, but also ensure I-GUIDE impacts our society in a positive way. We're thrilled to have this incredible opportunity to tackle complex global challenges of resilience and sustainability. And I hope you will join us in this journey. Get more information on our website, iguide.illinois.edu. Thank you.
So with that introduction, and if the I'm watching the chat, if the audio is not coming out as clearly as one would hope over Zoom, we have the video available at a later time as well. My role in all of this with I-GUIDE is as a co-lead for the education and workforce development team, along with my other co-lead, Mohan Ramamurthy from UCAR. And I also want to extend a thank you to our phenomenal team within the education and workforce development group, who are really a great group of scholars trying to move the needle in education and workforce development. So while you're listening to me today, what I would really encourage everyone to do is watch out for more webinar presentations, because there's going to be even better ideas coming from each of them in the coming months and over the years that I-GUIDE's going on. So today, I'm going to say that we're rather early in our journey. So we're about 6 months into a 5-year I-GUIDE project. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. So there's a lot of change happening right now. I'm going to be raising just as many questions as I provide perspectives and potential answers about the big world out there outside of Zoom. I think all of us are getting quite familiar with Zoom, but there is a big, beautiful world out there filled with all sorts of amazing creatures, plants, people, and landscapes that we've all seen and experienced with our own eyes. What many of us, including many of you in this webinar, have also started to realize is that we live in an increasingly cyber world filled with computing in the clouds and data streams and data lakes and mountains of location information, all of which are creating a data tsunami. Increasingly, we're starting to understand our world, not just through our own eyes and experiences, but through data. And these two worlds, the real world and the cyber world, are starting to converge. And we see it in all sorts of places and under all sorts of names. So common names that you might see nowadays are digital twins, smart cities, geo AI, geospatial data science, Internet of Things. The list continues to grow as we deploy more sensors, more satellites, more data gathering techniques, as we collect and make sense of more data through a variety of different methods, techniques, and technologies. And it's interesting that geospatial data is actually at the center of I-GUIDE. It's actually what connects our transformative understanding from the Convergent Science Catalyst team and the Geospatial AI and Data Science team that I'm also a member of, with the technological I-GUIDE platform, along with the rest of the teams, including education and workforce development. So while today I'm going to be talking about the convergence of the real world and the cyber world, this is simply one example of convergent learning that I-GUIDE is going to be interested in studying. And I'm going to be focusing on that use case because that's really what I need. Because as a faculty member, I'm actually both a producer and a consumer of education. At about this time last year, I was a co-organizer of the GeoAI Trillion Pixel Challenge hosted by Oak Ridge National Lab. That's asking a fundamental question of how can we make sense of trillions of pixels of high resolution satellite imagery before the next snapshot of the Earth happens a day later. So how can we process trillions of pixels of the Earth's surface every 24 hours before those pixels are regenerated? My co-organizer, Dr. May Casterline, and I held a session on building a scalable geospatial architecture. And I showed this slide, basically talking about the process where we go from the real world all the way through the software stack and down into the hardware stack that I affectionately call global to gates. And what I focused on that little slice of our introductory presentation is that most of GIScience education is focused on that center box. Sure, we delve into the processes, but we focus a lot of our attention on developing models, working with libraries, and getting into a little bit of Python programming. But ultimately, myself as a researcher, what I need in terms of trained students and staff or other faculty members are people who are knowledgeable, have expertise and skills across this entire spectrum from globe to gates. But instead of that, what many of us are facing is essentially this question. I've heard a question like this raised in platforms like this in personal conversations. And the question is basically, which would you prefer? Would you rather teach a GIS expert how to program? Or do you teach a programmer how to use GIS? And what I would like to say is that that's not actually what we want, that this is actually a bad set of questions, and that our needs in this community and outside, especially for our project partners, have really started to change. And what we really need are geospatial programmers and geospatial infrastructure specialists with knowledge and skills in both areas. So what that suggests is that our educational model is not really keeping up with our needs. So today, what I really want to focus on is discussing, do we need a new educational model? And if so, what might that look like? And then talk about a few of the first steps in my journey and some of the projects that I've been involved in, starting with the NSF-supported Hour of CI project, or Hour of Cyberinfrastructure, a new project that we're starting at the University of Minnesota called the GeoCommons. And then, of course, I-GUIDE, which is this is the first webinar series presentation for I-GUIDE. And then followed by a final question of where should we go from here? So I think it's important to recognize that we take a step back and look at education and workforce development. And those are very big words. And it's important to recognize that when we say education workforce development, what we're really talking about is a very complex and global network of people, institutions, workplaces, and processes, all of them aiming to help people learn and advance knowledge. So one key question that's been raised is, how can one institute, I-GUIDE, affect such a complex global system? And my answer to that is by pushing new ways of doing things. This is something that we researchers are very akin to doing, is to pushing the boundaries. And I would like to take that same mentality and apply it to education and workforce development. And I want to share this quote that was allegedly by Henry Ford, which shows us that change is hard. And really, we have to look beyond the current ways of doing things. And this is something that I really want to explore with our time today. And of course, what we're talking about is the Ford Motors Company application of the assembly line for the construction of the automobile. Now here, what I want to point out is that it's important to notice Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. He did not invent the assembly line. Importantly, he did not revolutionize automobile technology. What he did was simply change the way automobiles were built, which then revolutionized transportation around the world. So one idea, one process ended up changing the world. And I think it's this sort of a mentality that we can take as we start to build up education and workforce development in projects like I-GUIDE. Now, of course, education has its own Model T. And many of you likely experienced this model if you went to university. So you may have taken gen ed courses or now liberal education courses, which gives you breadth of knowledge. These are your 101 and 1000 level courses that teach you a little bit about a lot of stuff. And then you jump to your major courses where you gain depth of knowledge in chemistry, computer science, or geography. And this is really the university's efficient assembly line, where students enter the top, they spend their first year or two taking liberal education, and then they transition to their disciplinary major courses in later years. They exit out of the bottom, and this is how we intentionally or unintentionally create disciplinary silos through disciplinary specific degree programs. Now, it's worth noting in this model that there's really no incentive for learners or instructors for that matter to go beyond their silo, because you're either gaining breadth or you're gaining depth. Now, if we go back to the automobile example, if this process, the assembly line, is so disruptive and so efficient, then why are the roads not filled with Model Ts today? I think it's safe to say that the needs of transportation and of people have evolved since the year 1913. What I do know is that there are plenty of Model T students and learners on the sidewalks today. And I think that this is something to point out and to pay attention to as we start moving into this post-pandemic era. And I think that this is something that we really need to look at and to pay attention to. In terms of automobiles, the reason why we don't see Model Ts is that innovation continued. The world kept moving forward. The introduction of technology to the assembly line allowed even more efficient processes. Automobile manufacturers created newer and newer models, right? And this speed of innovation continued to push things forward. Now, of course, education isn't standing still. We do have new models, one of which is called the Pi model. And this is an alternative model to the T. This is where we add a second leg, a second area of knowledge depth. And here, this is an example of having double majors or major and minors in complementary fields. Maybe you want to get an MBA plus have a disciplinary degree. Perhaps nowadays, many students and learners are starting to take data science plus a disciplinary science to complement it. But what's interesting about this model is that they're still not talking to each other. What you're doing is entering two separate silos where there's not really a lot of interaction. What we might need, and what I'm potentially proposing, is a new model, maybe a Model C student, where we have more of a convergent model, where learners and instructors are intentionally bridging the silos in integrating knowledge. So here, it's really worth noting that the education process might be changing, but the education itself, the content, meaning the methods, the data, the theories, the ways of thinking, that's not changing. Just as Henry Ford didn't change the automobile, he simply changed the process in which we built automobiles. I think that we need to adapt that sort of thinking to this. And all that we need to do is start to look at what are some convergent points that we can start to blend different ways of looking at the world. So what might this look like? One potential example is what we call cyber literacy for GIScience. A number of collaborators and I, a great group of scholars, worked for a long period of time to craft this new idea that we call cyber literacy for GIScience. This was published in the Professional Geographer, and we define cyber literacy for GIScience as the ability to understand and use established and emerging technologies to transform all forms and magnitudes of geospatial data into information for interdisciplinary problem solving. So that's a big, weighty definition with lots of jargon. So I'm very much a practical person that wants to understand what does that actually mean and how can I apply it. So in the publication, we outline cyber literacy for GIScience having 8 core knowledge areas. And they're arranged in overlapping areas situated in 2 scientific areas. One is geographic information science, which is the left side. And then on the right side, we have computational science. So within GIScience, we have the technologies and the methods, which are spatial modeling and analytics. Moving down, we go into geospatial data and then into spatial thinking. On the right side for computational science, we have a focus on parallel computing, big data, and computational thinking. What's important here is that cyber literacy has intentional bridges across these two science domains. On the technology side, we use cyber infrastructure as kind of a middleware and a technological bridge to span the methods of spatial modeling and analytics with parallel computing. And on the bottom, on the people and problem solving side, we have interdisciplinary communication to span the different ways of thinking for these two sciences. So in this way, as learners are gaining depth, as they're learning the methods, the data, the ways of thinking, they're also starting to bridge those ways of thinking through interdisciplinary communication and cyber infrastructure. Now, I don't know that this approach is perfect for a convergent learning scenario, but I do think that it's perhaps a step in the right direction. It is something that is worth exploring. And that's really what I'm trying to focus on today, is the first few steps in this process of I-GUIDE as we're trying to bring together all of these teams and really trying to move the needle for education and workforce development. So in terms of first steps, I want to share 3 projects that I'm involved in. One is the Hour of Cyber Infrastructure, or Hour of CI for short. And the Hour of CI is a National Science Foundation project funded by the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure. And what it is a nationwide campaign introducing hundreds of diverse undergraduate and graduate students to cyber infrastructure. Our kind of target audience are geospatial, are the geospatial sciences, the social sciences, environmental sciences, and anybody who's kind of geospatially adjacent, which ends up being a multitude of fields, as you could imagine. I have 3 wonderful co-PIs, Karen Kemp, Forrest Bolick, and Anand Padmanabhan. And in this project, we are developing 17 lessons. The first is our introductory gateway lesson entitled Hello World of Cyber Infrastructure. And then we're developing a beginner and an intermediate lesson in each of those 8 core areas that we defined in cyber literacy. Each of these lessons are interactive and problem-based, and they really only cover the foundational concepts and core skills that you would learn in your first hour of learning any of these particular areas. We have a project website, hourofci.org, if you're interested in more information. The lessons themselves are actually what we call Jupyter notebooks. This is a specific form of computational notebooks. And essentially what they are is a document filled with markdown, executable code, interactive maps, interactive runnable code that are all self-contained, self-paced, and platform enabled. So what we use is a technology called Jupyter Notebook, which is used by thousands of data scientists around the world that are oftentimes used to tell your science story with executable code. They're fantastic for research, and I found that they are wonderful for teaching. I use them all the time in my courses in terms of lab exercises. Another component of the project, we are trying to build the community. We actually identified, as we were kind of working on the cyber literacy paper, that we have 2 communities who are trying to learn from each other. Of course, we have our learner community who's trying to learn cyber literacy for GIScience in order to potentially get a job, to do their research if they're in grad school, and these sorts of things. We also have an instructor community who's asking the question, how do we teach this stuff? How do we bring this into our already full curriculums, especially if I don't have expertise in these topics ourselves? So in order to get at that community building aspect, we developed a process where our aim for the project was to develop best practices which would guide the development of lessons by our lesson developers. The lessons themselves would teach learners cyber literacy. Embedded within the lessons are assessments so that learners can understand if they're actually learning something productive. And those assessments provide us data that then improve our best practices, providing a nice feedback loop. So this is one way that we were able to kind of build a process for building community that we could potentially move over and apply to I-GUIDE. Now, in terms of the lessons themselves, one of their goals was to lower barriers for learning. So in our cyber infrastructure lesson, we actually are using estimating catapult trajectories from Archimedes to introduce input and output in algorithms. In our parallel computation lesson, we're using farmers planting seeds in fields to talk about workload balance and decomposition. We're bringing in technical concepts without the technical jargon and trying to build learners' understanding through context and connections rather than really in-depth examples, and then build on that as we move forward into the more advanced lessons. Importantly, we also need to lower barriers for instructors. This is a major barrier because if instructors are not comfortable with the material and the topics, they're not going to introduce it to their students. They're not going to bring it into their classrooms. So in order to help that process, each of our lessons comes with a lesson plan, which includes the learning objectives and the concepts that the learners are going to learn, but also a preparation guide and an instructional guide to help a lot of these instructors who might be an expert in GIScience, but not cyber infrastructure, or might know a lot about big data, but doesn't have any experience in geospatial data. So it allows the instructors to gain a little bit of confidence and competency before they introduce it to their students. So this is one way that we can help lower barriers, not only for learners, but instructors through this kind of technological platform process. One of the key lessons that we learned in this project that's still ongoing, by the way, we had a number of COVID-related disruptions that it is a topic for a different webinar entirely, is that we originally thought, oh, 17-hour-long lessons, that's not too bad. What was lurking beneath the surface was the amount of energy and effort that it takes to change the process from an instructor-led lesson, which is what many of our lesson developers were comfortable with. We can talk for an hour about nearly anything as a practice professor, to a platform-enabled self-paced learning environment. That takes a significant amount of time and a significant amount of effort. And this is something that I'm really excited about I-GUIDE moving forward, but is something that was a lesson learned as we were moving forward. That said, the model does work. Despite the pandemic, we were able to run a soft pilot last spring, spring of 2021, where we reached almost 200 diverse learners. We published a paper in EDU HPC, and we were honored by winning the best paper award for the paper, where we showed that these introductory hour-long lessons are able to meet the needs of at least exposing, these concepts and skills to a very broad array of learners. Learners came from over 40 fields of study. We had a very diverse group of learners from a variety of races, ethnicities, and genders. So we were quite excited about trying to broaden the impact of the project, and we will continue to do this as we move forward. So with that, I want to pivot to GeoCommons. And this is actually a very different model because what we're building is actually a space or a place for space. And this is going to be built at the University of Minnesota, which prides itself as being the first spatial university. There was recently a textbook just published about a month ago, led by Steve Manson, along with a number of other authors, entitled Building the Spatial University, Spatial Thinking, Learning, and Service Throughout the System. At the core of University of Minnesota's Spatial University is GeoSpatial, a unit that's really dedicated to support spatial research and increasingly teaching and learning. In its first 5 years, GeoSpatial supported over 2,000 researchers across 150 departments and research centers. Currently, they maintain over 18,000 ArcGIS accounts. This is 18,000 geospatial and geospatial adjacent researchers, students, postdocs, staff members that are creating maps and geospatial data sets, over 135,000 of them. If you want to read more, the spatialuniversity.umn.edu. But really what I want to talk about is the GeoCommons. We are literally in the design phase. I'm talking with the design firm right now of creating a new place for space. And really what the GeoCommons is going to be is a collaborative hub for geospatial research, education, and engagement. So not only is it going to be a place, but we're also aiming to have some programming. I don't have enough time to go into all of the details, but we're hoping to create micro insertion activities down to 15 minutes where people can just play with a certain set of ideas and technologies and data sets all the way up to full courses, where we're really trying to focus on serendipitous interaction and collaboration. I know in times of COVID and everything being online that model is starting to adjust, but really what we want is to give learners, researchers an opportunity to try stuff and break things. And what I'm most excited about is we're going to have a place to explore the entire geospatial pipeline, from data generation and collection through sensors, to data storage and analysis, including processing, all the way through interaction and geovisualization in a single collaborative environment. So stay tuned, because I think this is going to play a major role in I-GUIDE, where we can really start to experiment and play with convergent teaching and learning. I want to then focus our attention on I-GUIDE itself. So as co-lead of education and workforce development, we have 3 tasks in our group. The first task is to understand, learn from, and forge connections with communities of practice. Everybody on this webinar, I'm talking to you. Our second task is to design connections to the I-GUIDE platform to provide that technological bridge to support research linked learning pathways. And then our third task is to provide and create innovative instructional and training activities for converging science education. So in terms of the first task, I think we can take the model or a piece of the model that we've learned from Hour of CI and kind of systematize the process of interaction, but we need to broaden the network. We have our global education network that I mentioned at the very beginning. We have our fantastic partner community. Thank you for many of you for joining us today. We have other communities, development communities, open source communities, private communities, infrastructure communities, all of which we can understand and learn from. So this is kind of step 1. So in short, we want to hear from you. We want to hear the roadblocks that you're experiencing, as well as the bright spots, and not just from educators and learners, but our partners as well. So what's working and what's not working? In terms of our second task, I think one of the things that I look to take away is the lesson that we learned from Hour of CI, where we have a lot of work lurking under the water in terms of creating a platform-enabled novel process to support those learning pathways. I'm excited to say that the Hour of CI lessons themselves are actually moving to the I-GUIDE platform. So a lot of what we've learned in Hour of CI is actually going to get moved over into I-GUIDE, which is going to be kind of an exciting prospect to at least jumpstart the conversation. Is that going to be the end of it? Absolutely not. But again, this is just the first steps in our journey in this process. And the third task is actually the one that I'm most excited about, because this is where we get to start exploring what does it mean to actually change the model of education to meet the needs of today and tomorrow? So what does it look like to introduce a Model C student with convergent science education, especially in places like the GeoCommons that's coming up? So I think we have 3 big tasks in front of us. I think we have some initial steps for task 3 to at least get the ball rolling. But most of all, what I'm really excited about is that we had so many people join us in this webinar to help us understand what we're up against, where we need to go, and perhaps how we need to get there. So with that, I want to ask, where should we go from here? And I'm going to ruin it a little bit to say I'm not sure. Like I said, these are only the first few steps in our journey. So we're about 6 months into a 5-year project. What I do want to say is I want to ask for something as co-lead. We need your help. We really need your help to understand what are the roadblocks, what are the bright spots, and these sorts of things. And I know in the education space, everyone is talking about the new normal. Many people are talking about it in terms of what happens after we emerge from this COVID pandemic that we're all in. And what's it going to look like in terms of in-person versus more Zoom boxes versus a hybrid environment. But I'd like to reframe that conversation, at least for I-GUIDE and some of the activities that I'm in, to talk about a new normal in terms of geospatial education. And the new normal that I hope that we all strive for is that of innovation, where innovation becomes the new normal for us, where we continue to adapt to meet the needs of everyone around us so that we can actually get to the convergent science drivers and to solve some of the major world problems that I-GUIDE's trying to tackle. So with that, I want to acknowledge a whole host of organizations and people that have made all of this work possible. So of course, National Science Foundation providing support for I-GUIDE, as well as for the Hour of Cyberinfrastructure project, as well as Exceed, which is a major cyber infrastructure project that is starting to wind down, but has provided enormous support for myself, my career in these projects, including Hour of CI. The I-GUIDE team has provided all sorts of ideas and contributions and will continue to contribute. The Hour of CI project contributors, partners, lesson developers, pilot instructors, and students. I imagine in a couple of years when this acknowledgement section goes through with I-GUIDE, we're going to have a very big list of wonderful contributors. Davide Del Vento and GeoCommons support was generously supported by the College of Liberal Arts, the Minnesota Population Center, and the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, who's provided support so that we can actually build this space and fill it with all of these exciting technologies. With that, I would like to thank you all for your time. My email address is available. The video is going to be available. The slides are going to be available. But most importantly, please look out for follow-up information. We're going to be having follow-up activities and engagement opportunities for our project partners and for everybody else so that we can continue to forge these new relationships, because I think it's going to take all of us to really meet the needs of today as well as tomorrow. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time. And I will stop sharing so that we can see Mike.
There we go. So thank you so much, Eric. That was a lot of very exciting ideas. And congratulations to the I-GUIDE team on having got so far in the first 6 months. And these are still very early days, but lots of new ideas about education and workforce development. I want to pick up a couple of things from what you said. But first, just to note that, as you said, that change is hard, that it's sometimes said that academia is the second most conservative industry known to humanity. The most conservative being classical opera. And so the question then of how to disrupt becomes a very, very difficult question. We are siloed. We are particularly traditional in our methods of publication and academic advancement, despite years and years and years of critique and years of suggestions for how we might revolutionize. And perhaps we could be thinking that one of the most promising areas of disruption is in fact geospatial thinking or spatial thinking, if you like. I was trying to think when you were talking about the Spatial University, whether there's any other adjective I could put in front of university that would have as much meaning. And I really can't think of any examples. I think of Arizona State University, which calls itself the New American University. But it still isn't trying to revolutionize in the way that I think Spatial University does. So I want to talk about two specific topics, both of them having to do with context. And when we think of context in a geospatial sense, we usually think of spatial heterogeneity. We usually think about how the world is not uniform, about how what goes on in the Twin Cities is very different from what goes on in Beijing. And we ask questions like, what do Beijing and the Twin Cities have in common? Or in what ways are they different? What can I learn from one that is true of the other, but not necessarily true, but other things that are not true of the other? And so I think that it's very important to recognize the importance of context. And we've done that, of course, for many years in the geospatial world. We benefit enormously from geospatial data, which now provides very rich context. In fact, what Esri calls geo-enrichment, meaning simply that we bring other sources of geospatial data in to understand context. That leads me, though, to wonder about the field experience. Because one, although we can say that the digital world and the real world are converging, they will never fully converge. It will never be possible to capture all of reality in a digital environment. And so we must anticipate that until that day comes, as it never will, we must do something to understand the differences between the real world and the digital world, between the real world and its digital twin, if you like, or between the universe and the metaverse, if you like. What comes down very nicely if you talk about it, the real world, versus bit, the digital world. The question of it versus bit, I think is a very interesting question. Secondly, though, and the second aspect of context, which is rather different, not the sort of thing that we usually talk about in geography, is the context of scientific discovery and the principles of science. Principles such as replicability and reproducibility, the need to verify findings by replicating them, the need for transparency in scientific activity, the need for concern for uncertainty, for finding a set of universal terms which have standard rigorous meaning, the need to know all of the literature when studying a particular topic. So given all that, how can we make geospatial discovery easier, something you've talked about, but at the same time retain the norms, the principles of science? And that, I think, is going to be a hugely important question. It's a question then about the context of scientific discovery and how in all these wonderful new ideas, we can maintain the transparency of science, the replicability of science, as we have attempted to do, of course, for centuries. The second area I wanted to talk about briefly is this idea of convergence and the question of wide versus deep, the pie model, as you talked about. And unfortunately, it's often been said that the deep approach results in learning more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. And the breadth approach argues for knowing less and less about more and more until you know nothing about everything. And these are issues that, of course, have pervaded science and puzzled and bothered scientists for a long, long time. Against that, we are now in a world of collaboration. And I can't imagine how many people are involved in the I-GUIDE project, but as you said, the eventual list of thanks will be enormously long. How do we ensure collaboration across such a large and diverse group? Because after all, most of us have been trained for a single investigator world, and we have struggled to get away from that model for a long, long time without all that much success. You talked about the GeoCommons, and I want to suggest that one of the most important aspects of the GeoCommons is what it requires in the way of human behavior, the behavior of humans who are in a collaborative environment. What do they learn about working with each other? And I came across a very interesting term earlier this week. We talk about teams of scientists, but have we talked about the science of teams? The principles that are involved in creating teams. What are those principles? What are the differences between a leader in a collaborative team and the members of a collaborative team? How much does each member of the collaborative team need to know about the work of the others? And what I'm suggesting is that I-GUIDE gives us an opportunity to think deeply and systematically about the human behavior of collaboration. What does it take to create successful collaboration? And how much should that be part of the training, the education of the students for this future workforce of collaborative science? So that was a very brief summary of some of the things I was thinking about while you were talking. There are 3 points I'd like to focus just before I finish. Draw out 3 points as take-home messages. The first one is the field experience, the importance of the field experience, which will always be there. And we will never reach a world in which we do science entirely independently of the field. And then secondly, the context provided by the norms of science, how to ensure that the standards of science, which have been traditional for so long, remain important in this future world. And then the third, this idea of the science of teams, of studying and training students, teaching students how to work as teams. So thanks very much for your attention, and thank you again for a very exciting presentation.
Thanks so much to both of you, Eric and Mike. The wonderful presentation and insightful comments made by Mike's discussion. Now we're getting to the Q&A mode of the webinar. We still have about 10 minutes left. And we have one question, Mike, I'll be reading out that for you from the Q&A box. And I think that's relevant to both of your areas of expertise here. So the question is, you mentioned the silo problem in education. Have you seen examples from other disciplines about best practices for cyber infrastructure training in their domains? I think you could replace cyber infrastructure with the GIS in that question.
Yeah, and I think there are many different models, and they vary greatly depending on whether we're talking about the humanities or the social sciences or the natural science, the environmental sciences, all of which are increasingly making use of geospatial tools and data. I suspect that it's time to do a more systematic analysis of that. This is perhaps something that I-GUIDE could consider. A systematic survey of the common practices in geospatial education within disciplinary silos, and drawing parallels, noting differences. I think that would be a very useful contribution from the Institute.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question and something that I personally struggle with, because again, I need my students, grad students and undergraduate students, to have experience in CI training. I think one interesting example that we've talked about within the I-GUIDE team is actually the course, The Missing Semester, taught at MIT. So this is taught in their, here, I can throw it into the chat. This is taught in their J term, or kind of gap term, where they literally talk about the things that are, I would say, CI IT related, that don't get incorporated into your traditional 15-week class. But I think what Mike is saying makes a lot of sense, of seeing, you know, how much is that sneaking into our traditional 15-week classes? And if it's not, what are we doing to fill the gaps? Because we have GeoSpatial, which do a number of trainings webinars, lunch and learns, and these sorts of things that help fill the gaps. We also have, map librarians across the US at least that do these sorts of things. So, but I think a survey to try to read the room, as it were, would be incredibly valuable.
Thank you for those answers. Another question in the Q&A I'll be reading out, I think mostly for Eric, is the CI, Cyber Infrastructure Training and I-GUIDE initiative applicable to high school students?
Fantastic question. The hour of CI materials as of right now are not. Our IRB is only pertains to individuals who are above 18 years and older, so that we didn't have to get parental signatures since it's a research project. One of the things that I fully intend to do as we move the lessons over from the NSF funded Hour of Cyber Infrastructure project to I-GUIDE is to not have it be a research project, only have it be educational material, and then absolutely those materials would be available to high school students. My son is actually quite interested in it, and he's 13. I told him officially, because of IRB standards, I can't allow him to even participate in the lessons. But yes, I think that those materials would be available.
A quick follow-up. How about community college student?
Yes, so we actually have partnered with some community colleges to get Hour of CI lessons into the community colleges in especially 2-year institutions. So they're absolutely available for anyone for free. And yes, that would be fantastic. I know within I-GUIDE, we've talked a little bit about outreach into the community colleges, because this is a huge group of learners and people who are going to go out and impact the world. So this is certainly a group that we're hoping to reach.
So thanks much, Eric. There are a couple more questions popping up in the Q&A. The first one, again, just reading loud for the benefit of the attendees here. What's the current status of the Hour of CI lessons? Are the beginner lessons completed now so that they can be used in the classroom at this point?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we do have a few beginner lessons that are ready to go that has been put into classrooms as of last spring. We have a suite of them that are about this close to being finished and ready for kind of public use and for piloting. So I was hoping at this stage that they would have already been out and available, but COVID related disruptions continue to this day. Unfortunately, I ended up getting COVID in January, which has kind of tanked a little bit of my my availability as PI of the project. But yes, we have a number of lessons that are already available. If you sign up, we can certainly make them available, and then the rest of them are coming. We've had a number of instructors that have also are lesson developers that have also had COVID related disruptions that we have to be patient with.
I think the next question would be interesting to hear both Mike and Eric's insights. That is how the panelists see the influence of tech vendors in promoting certain lines of applications and also with impact on curriculum.
I think that's, as you say, that's a very interesting question. I think that we are very lucky in this field to have an associated tech industry. And one of the great things about geospatial work to me has always been the fact that it is real, it is useful, and it's widely applied. Given that, I think that we can expect certain lines of investigation, certain lines of application to grow and flourish in the industry. At the same time, as academics, I think it's our responsibility to be critical where necessary, to draw attention of students to these applications, to invite them to think about them critically, and to use that as an important part of their education.
Thanks, Mike. Eric, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I think if you compare GIS, geospatial to a decade ago, let's say, I think what we're experiencing is a much richer ecosystem as things move to the cloud, as data sets become bigger. This is kind of disrupting some of the flow as data science and AI and deep learning continue to advance. This is opening up not always the best ways of doing things, but different ways of doing things. I do think that it is interesting because we are seeing a little bit of a shift back to perhaps the Bell Lab days, where you're starting to get again these major groups. I think originally we used to talk about Esri and GIScience, but we also have the Googles and the Apples that all have, very big mapping and geospatial units that are doing, a lot of different things that are useful. But as Mike said, I believe that we need to be critical of what's going on, and, really making some conscious choices in terms of what we're teaching, why we're teaching it, and what technologies we're using or perhaps not using. And especially as these things evolve, that's a continuing conversation. But I agree that I think that we are very fortunate that we have a flourishing tech industry, because they provide all sorts of innovation that we incorporate into universities. They also hire our students, which is of course very good to the entire industry. So
Yeah, maybe you have a little bit more time just to address one final question, which is definitely an interesting one. Eric, you were caught in this question. You talk about the Ford changed the auto industry via the idea of the assembly line. And certainly you emphasize team or horizontal integration. Can you elaborate the tension between the two, which also relates to the science team notion mentioned by Mike?
yeah, I have many slides that I unfortunately didn't have time to go into. I suppose this is where, if I was a newer age professor, I would start making TikTok videos of all of these slides that didn't make the cut, little short snippets of things. I almost changed that slide to actually say, while Henry Ford is always allegedly quoted, he was not operating alone. He did not solely come up with that idea, nor did he solely implement that idea. I think that that's really important. And this is where I think Mike's comment in terms of the principles of science and of acknowledgement and recognition is really important. I do think that teams are a better way of generating these novel breakthrough ideas. And I actually really try to push back on the single person narrative. I may or may not have been in a faculty meeting just last week, pushing back on the credit for first authorship for publications and how that counts for promotion and tenure, because this is something that we really struggle with in a project like I-GUIDE, where we have, dozens of unique contributors, but only one person gets to be that first author in a publication. So I think that these are some things that we are going to have to work through. And I do think that it's important to focus a lot more on team rather than individual. So I agree that there's that tension there. And I think that this is something that, even in science, I'm going to argue we're really trying to go through. I know Shawan's name is on a paper from High Energy Physics that has over 1,000 authors on it. And the first author, it's alphabetical order. So if you're aardvark, you win you win the lottery on that one. So I do think that this is a continued conversation, but I understand the tension there.
Thanks, Eric. Well, that might be a big enough topic, getting us segue to the wrap up of this first webinar of the I-GUIDE webinar series where we're kicking off today here. Let me invite everyone to give a big round of applause to both Eric Shook and Mike Child for very insightful but stimulating discussions and presentation today. So thanks so much. But also a big thank you to Tony Makusu, who's our media expert here, as well as Anand Padmanabhan, who's the managing director of NSF I-GUIDE, working behind the scene very hard, making sure today's webinar is run as smoothly as you have experienced. We anticipate making our webinars available once every a few months, so stay tuned. And today's webinar is recorded and will be available on the website of I-GUIDE for your review. And Eric will organize community activities, as he mentioned, to engage further interactions on this topic. So stay tuned, and thank you all very much for your participation today, and wish you all the best in this evolving and uncertain environment. That concludes today's webinar, and see you next time.